Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're continuing along with Chapter 2 from the book Influence. Whoa, look at that. I got my own theme music now. From the book Influence, Chapter 2, or was it? Are we on Chapter 3? No, it is Chapter 2, Reciprocation. Going over the first principle of influence that Dr. Cialdini highlights in his book. We had part 1 last time. We're going to do part 2 today. Part 2 is going to be focusing on something that is also considered reciprocity, but not in the way that we were talking about in part 1, where in part 1 we talked about giving a small favor to somebody up front and then expecting them to reciprocate that favor. In part 2, we're going to be talking about reciprocal concessions, where you're not necessarily giving somebody like a small gift or a small act of kindness. You're giving them the act of a concession. So it's almost, instead of pushing something forward to somebody, giving somebody something, you are retracting back your initial offer. We're going to talk about this right now. Let's go. Here's our first slide where we left off last time. All right. So reciprocal connections. Reciprocal concessions. The obviously reciprocation obligation to repay back favors. Right? We talked about that last time. But also there's an obligation to make a concession to someone who has also made a concession to us. And this is what I came to know from a sales technique called foot in the door technique. And Dr. Cialdini calls it rejection, then retreat. And let me just skip ahead here. So members of society working together toward the achievement of common goals, yes. Setting aside disagreements for the betterment of social cooperation. Absolutely, that's what we're getting with the concession. You're starting off with something like an extreme demand, and I don't mean extreme like outrageous, but something that's very high, and then you're conceding back to a smaller request. So what is this? Number 1, pressuring the recipient of an already made concession to respond in kind. And 2, people are free to make the initial concession and thereby to begin the beneficial process of exchange. So, yes, these two things are what Robert says happens when you make a concession. You're pressuring the recipient of an already made concession to respond in kind. So, how I take that is when I come down on my offer, let's say, I'm selling like a house, I come down from that initial price, it's going to make it seem to the other person that, okay, I should take that offer because of the concession that they made. I should reciprocate by accepting that concession. And then 2, people are free to make the initial concession and thereby to begin the beneficial process of exchange. If there was no social obligation, nobody would make the first sacrifice. And again, I think this harkens back to evolutionarily why we have these things, why you feel that it's okay to make concessions. Because if nobody made concessions, then nobody would ever sacrifice anything, and people would just come to the negotiating table, no matter what it was, and just make their demands and not stray from it like whatsoever. But here, it's seen as a sign of, okay, you want to make a deal, you want things beneficial for both people. I get it that, in negotiations, sometimes that's not always the case. You're out to totally get 100% what you want. I totally get it. But in a lot of exchanges, when you initiate that initial concession, you're initiating that beneficial process of exchange. And again, trade, aid, gift giving, commerce, business, all of that stuff is now free to encircle throughout the society, or goods are free to circle throughout society. So Robert calls this reciprocal concessions the rejection, then retreat. I almost said principle, but that's what he calls it. This is the technique that's used, rejection, then retreat, aka the door in the face. So, like I said previously, you make a large request that's likely to get turned down, but then you follow it up with a smaller request that's more likely now to get accepted. The second request could be objectively large, but it's smaller than the original request, making it seem like it's not that bad of a request. So, they had a study, this county youth counseling program study. Oh, yeah, okay, I remember this one. So, they came in to a group of people, and I'm going to paraphrase this for everybody. They came to a group of people and they asked, okay, would you chaperone a group of juvenile delinquents to a zoo for their annual zoo trip or whatever for several hours on a particular day? And 83% refused. Then they went to other groups of people and they asked an initial request of, okay, would you commit to spending 2 hours a week as a counselor for these juvenile delinquents for a minimum of 2 years? When people refused or did not accept those terms, they then followed it up with that first bullet point of, okay, would you just do it for a Saturday for a couple hours? And they found that 3 times as many people accepted the request of the zoo trip if it was preceded by the long-term contractual obligation. So they went from 17% accepting to 50% accepting. Huge difference. But as with anything, there's a catch to making the rejection then retreat work. Your first set of demands can't be so extreme. You can't be like, all right, I want $1 million for my house. Oh, that's too expensive. Okay, well, how about $100K? It's like, what? You know, you can't have it be so extreme. I remember there's a book, and we should probably do a series on this book, Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. And I think he actually had a formula in there, like whatever number you're trying to hit, you make it like 1.7 or like just 2 times that number, or like 1.5 times that number, something like that. So then when you retreat, you're coming back to your just 1x number, so 150,000, you retreat back to 100,000, something like that. And then also, it's exaggerated just enough to allow for concessions. So it can't be so extreme that what you're going to end up getting when it's so extreme is that they just outright reject it. They walk away from you and they say, bye, sorry, Merry Christmas, I can't help you. That's too much, right? You want it to be just slightly exaggerated enough to keep them in the game, keep them in the negotiation process, and allow yourself to make some concessions. So there's a famous example, a concession story of the Watergate mystery, which this is a fascinating part of history that I am not super familiar with. I mean, I've heard of it, but I didn't know all these details. And there was some reciprocal concession specifically at play when it came to Watergate. So what was Watergate? Well, it was this idea it's a hotel, okay, but like the event, there was this idea that came from G. Gordon Liddy, who was in charge of the intelligence gathering operations for the committee to reelect the president, President Nixon at the time. So they wanted to break into the Watergate building hotel. Was it a hotel? I think it was a hotel. Were Watergate offices of the Democratic National Committee. Okay. And they wanted to bug it and essentially like steal information from it in order to help Nixon win the re-election. Robert kind of goes into why they wanted to do this. They don't really know, because according in the book, Edmund Muskie, the only announced candidate early polls had given a chance of unseating the president, had done poorly in the primaries. It looked as though he was the most defeatable candidate. George McGovern would end up winning the Democratic nomination. A Republican victory seemed assured. So why go about doing this? I don't know. But you're going to see why they did. Because the proposal was to have $250,000 in order to do the raid. Another spelling mistake. So the proposal was approved in the meeting between John Mitchell, Jeb Stuart Magruder, and Frederick LaRue. And you're thinking again, well, if Nixon had it on lock, why did they go ahead with this proposal then? But it's because it wasn't the initial proposal. And the initial plan called for $1 million. They were going to bug the Watergate offices of the Democratic National Committee, but they're also going to kidnap people. They're going to have mugging squads. They were going to have like a yacht full of like hookers, I think, to potentially blackmail Democratic Party National Committee workers, etc. So that was their initial plan. They walked it back to $500K, and they even said that was too high. So eventually they settled on the $250,000. So retreating back from $1 million in all those other bad things that they were going to do to just, okay, $250,000, we'll just bug the place. Doesn't seem that bad. Now, the thing is, LaRue did not agree with the proposal for the $250,000, but the thing was, he was never there for the initial ones anyway. So in his mind, he was not affected by the rejection and retreat technique because he wasn't there for the initial concession. So again, this kind of just all goes to show the power of reciprocity, the power of reciprocal concession, and that $250K on the surface, yes, why take that chance? But when you see that it came down from $1 million and all that extra stuff, it's like, okay, well, why not? Let's try it. Doesn't seem as bad. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. So Robert kind of flips the switch here. Kind of takes a look at the other side of the coin. Will people resent having been cornered into compliance? And what they found out was not really. There was this Canadian study that they highlight. There was this Canadian study that he highlights where, let me read it straight from the book. So they were volunteering for 2 hours of work per week for 2 years. Oh, okay. Very similar to the juvenile delinquent study where they asked people to, do you want to take these kids out to the zoo? Okay, so they're asking for volunteers for 2 hours of work per week for 2-year time commitment. Then they retreat to the smaller request, which was, I think, only, okay, well, how about just a couple hours just this Saturday, something like that. So yes, they got agreement, as you would expect, 76% of the time. Now, when they just asked first for the smaller request, they only got agreement 29% of the time. But then they looked at, okay, are people actually going to show up? And they found that with the rejection and retreat option, the people actually showed up to it 85% of the time versus 50% of the time when the rejection and retreat technique was not used. So the show up rate was way higher when you made the high demand and then came down to the low demand versus if you just started at the low demand. So it seems like you get greater compliance to actually fulfill the request when you reject and then retreat to it. For the future favors too, rejection and retreat worked better than just a flat out agreement to the initial request. And they did this with donations of blood. Again, similar kind of setup where they started off with, oh, do you want to donate this amount of blood this amount of times a week for this amount of years? Or do you, okay, if you don't want to do that, do you want to donate blood just this Friday? And obviously, the rejection and retreat technique probably got way more agreement, but it also got way more agreement in the future. Two, people were more likely to donate blood in the future when they had accepted the retreated request. So it's not just good for in the moment compliance, it's good for compliance even after the fact. So, to kind of summarize here, rejection and retreat, you're more likely to agree with the request. You're more likely to carry out the request, so like actually show up and do it. And you're more likely to carry out that request in the future. And Robert kind of highlights here that there's a couple things at play here that make this work. It's a greater sense of responsibility, and it's a greater sense of a satisfaction with the arrangement, meaning that people feel responsible for having brought the initial request down to a more manageable offer. They feel responsible for the terms, for them setting the terms of the contract. And then by virtue of that, they feel a greater satisfaction with having controlled the offer, and then also not seemingly paying as high of a price for it because they retreated back down to the lower offer. Let's move ahead. Okay, the UCLA study on the negotiation opponent. Ah, yes. I remember this one. Okay, so they had, let me go to that page really quick. This was where they had somebody, they had a subject, right? And they basically told the subject, okay, you've got this sum of money and you got to negotiate an amount to give to somebody else. You're bargaining with somebody, right? And if you can't come to an agreement, nobody gets the money. So what they did was they had a first group that made an extreme first demand, and they did not stray from it. They had a second group that made a moderate demand and also did not stray from it. They had a third group that had an extreme demand, but then eventually retreated to a smaller demand. And what do you guys think got the most compliance? Well, of course, it was the rejection, then retreat technique, that third group. I'm trying to find where exactly this was. Oh, I think I passed it. There we go. There were 3 important findings from here. I wonder if I put that on the next page. Yeah, I did. So 3 important findings. First, compared to the other 2 approaches, the strategy of starting with an extreme demand and then retreating to the more moderate one produced the most money for the person using it. This result is not surprising in light of other previous evidence we have seen and the power of larger than smaller request tactics to bring about profitable agreements, but it is the pair of additional findings of the study that are more striking. Oh, okay, so this is where we got into the responsibility and satisfaction. So people felt more responsible for the outcome, and they were more likely to live up to the terms of the agreement, so the term of the amount of money that they were going to divvy up. Okay. So 3 things. The first thing being more moderate one, the most money for the person. The first, compared to the other two approaches, the strategy of starting with an extreme demand and then retreating to a moderate one produced the most money. Okay, so that's first thing we learned from the UCLA negotiation study. Rejection and retreat works. Second is responsibility, in that when you used reciprocation, came to an agreement, you used that reciprocal concession, you're more likely to live up to the terms of the agreement, and you felt a greater responsibility for having dictated the terms of the contract, let's call it. And then lastly, you felt a greater satisfaction with the agreement, which meant that you were more likely to do business with the other person in the future. That's what it could potentially mean. I know this is like, oh, we're talking about just divvying up money here, but yes, okay. But in terms of like real world scenarios, whenever you feel satisfaction from a reciprocal concession, you're more likely to do business in the future, and you're more likely to agree with similar arrangements that come about. So overall, you're more satisfied with the final outcome, making you a little more happy, and then in the future, you're going to remember it and more likely to do business with this person in the future that just did the reciprocal concession with you. Again, and I take this as responsibility and satisfaction from the person who got the technique put on them. They feel like, oh, I got this person to come down on their price. So I feel good about it. I'm going to do business with this person in the future. You guys see what I'm saying there. Defense. I mentioned this in part 1. How do you combat this when you don't want to be pulled on the strings of indebtedness? And really simply, Robert kind of says you just need to recognize it and just recognize it for what it is when that's what they're doing, and just not play into it. And I realize that, yes, it's going to seem difficult to know if that initial request is honest or if it's an attempt at doing a reciprocal concession and exploiting a rejection, then retreat. Now, he says that you shouldn't just go around rejecting everything, because some things are good. Sometimes people are just going to give you gifts, favors, what have you, because they just want to do it. They want to feel good. They're not really expecting anything back. So you shouldn't just blanket reject everything as if it's going to be rejection then retreat. But you do want to determine if the initial request, is it an actual favor from like a friend, or is it a compliance tactic? And then when you realize if it's a compliance tactic, you feel less obligated to follow it if you know that the other person is just looking to profit off it. So I like what Robert says here. You meet favors with favors. But when other people are looking to profit off it, then you meet that same energy with the energy of, hey, I'm not going to play that game. You basically match it for what it is. You smoke out the enemy. You redefine the gift as a sales tactic, and then again, you're much less obligated to succumb to that concession when you realize that, oh, this is just a sales pitch. Oh, okay, well, I'm not interested. Right? And it's funny, Robert actually talks about, if they give you like little samples and gifts, and then they retreat back, they use reciprocal concession on you. Well, no. If they're trying to profit off you, you can profit off them. Just keep the samples. Have a nice day. Merry Christmas. Throw a little David Goggins in there for you guys. In summary, reciprocation is giving something to another person with the confidence it is not going to be lost. It's going to be returned back to you in kindness, not necessarily in the same value, in the same form, but somehow the favor is going to be returned back to you. We talked about the 3 characteristics of reciprocation in part 1. how you can make it even more powerful via customization, make the initial request or favor very personal. Reciprocation allows for uninvited first favors, so people are subject to just other people coming up to them and doing favors for them, where you don't really have a choice in the matter. And then it can lead to unequal exchanges, where the feeling of indebtedness is just so high that people will they will reciprocate something to you in a greater value, not even knowing it, knowing that they just want to not feel obligated to pay you back anymore. We saw this with, gave away a sample, a 10-cent Coke, and somebody bought raffle tickets that way exceeded the value of the can of Coke. We talked about rejection then retreat as another way of doing reciprocation. So this is called reciprocal concession. So instead of asking for a favor, you're asking for a concession down to a smaller request. And then we just talked about how to defend against these things is you have to match the favors for favors. So is something really a favor or is it a sales tactic? Are they trying to get something out of you and profit off you? And once you redefine it in that way, then you don't feel obligated anymore to follow along with their request. And guys, that's going to do it for this chapter. Reciprocation, influence, the psychology of persuasion. Guys, thank you very much for listening this far. I really, really appreciate it. Check out the Chee-Tash podcast where I'm interviewing very, very cool people. Just interviewed an author, Eric Bean. I've got another one coming out with Erica Emulander, Civil War novelist. Very cool lady. Next time, we're going to be talking about the liking principle of influence, chapter 3. Talking about how you are more likely to be influenced by somebody if you are like that person. Which has happened to me a lot in real life. But guys, thank you so much for listening. Tune in next time. Big things coming. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.